made by Trump suggests that Willis is prioritizing.
Good morning, Stuart. Good morning, Akash. Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Phil. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. If you've just joined, if you could mute, that would be great to allow our esteemed panel, Stephen Taylor, Adrian Boulding, and Chris Bunford, to talk on the wonderful subject of CDC. Thanks very much indeed for muting. Morning, Con. Morning, Simon. Morning, Gareth. Good morning, Ian. We'll just wait another minute or two for a few stragglers. If you have just joined, if you could mute, that'd be great. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Let's just do one more, two more. Oh, there's more coming in. So, morning, Richard. Morning, Jonathan. Morning, Peter. If you've just joined, if you could go on mute, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. Just to cut out any background noise, that would be wonderful. Morning, Philip. Good morning, Neil. Okay, it's now 10:33. If you've just joined, if you could mute, that would be good. Neil, I'm going to mute you. We've got more noise somewhere. That's it. Good. Excellent. Right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Pension Playpen's Coffee Morning. We are delighted to introduce Stephen Taylor from LCP, Chris Bunford from GP Actuarial, and Adrian Boulding from the CDC, RSA CDC, whichever way around you want to say that, Adrian. Apologies if I said that wrong. As usual, we are being recorded. So could we have thumbs up? Kerry, Julian, Brian, everybody's, we're recording for posting the video later on this afternoon to the Pension Playpen site. As usual, if you have any questions, please raise a hand. We do like interaction. And also, if you have any comments to make in the chat, please put it in the chat. But as you know, Henry and I will attack you in the chat room and see if you're prepared to unmute and ask your question or make your statement. So without further ado, I'll pass to Stephen Taylor to discuss CDC and beyond. So Stephen, thanks so much indeed in advance, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I must say, I'm terrified by the caliber of people joining this call as I'm watching their faces appear. It's looking more like a CDC industry call by the minute. But thank you for everyone who doesn't know much about CDC who's joining, and we'll try and make this as informative as possible. For those who don't know me, I'm Stephen Taylor. I'm partner at Lane Clark and Peacock, where I lead LCP's work on CDC. Outside of my day job, I'm current chair of the Association of Consulting Actuaries, and over the past couple of years, I spent quite a lot of time working with DWP. I can see Julian Barker on the call just now, working with Julian's team and other government and industry organisations on developments, and in particular, my focus is on multi-employer schemes. So I'll just hand over to Chris and then Adrian to introduce themselves, and then I think Chris will be kicking off the presentation.
Yes, thanks, Stephen. So yeah, I'm Chris Bunford. I've been working on CDC schemes for a number of years, helping sort of set up the design with Stephen before my move to Goddard Perry Actuarial, and so I've been involved in the discussions with Julian and his team and others. And I'll pass on to Adrian. Introduce himself.
Hi, good morning all. I'm Adrian Boulding. I'm a member of the RSA CDC Forum, which is a industry-wide group which exists to just try and bring along the development of CDC, identify what are the issues, and get people's brain power working together, trying to overcome them. RSA is a social impact charity. We believe firmly that CDC is a good thing, and we'd like to see it available as an option to as many people in the UK as possible. In addition to that, I have two day jobs. I work at the long-standing software firm Dunstan Thomas in Portsmouth, and I am chair of the FinTech Spire Platform Solutions.
Fantastic, thanks, Adrian. So I will just kick off and with some wonderful technology that Adrian showed me earlier this week. I'm going to talk through some slides on CDCs. giving a quick introduction, and as Stephen said, I've seen the caliber of people on the call, but I'm aware some of you may not know as much about CDCs. But I wanted to talk through it from a point of view of what people actually want from their pensions and what they actually want from their pension schemes. So I've put up here a number of, if I just start that, things that I think that employers would like from their pension scheme. Things like stable contributions, being a simple, understandable design, staff valuing the benefit, the money working hard in the pension scheme. If you've got any others, please do add them in the chat, and we can talk through them and see how they work with the CDC designs that we've got. And I also want to consider what members want from their pension schemes. Again, stable member contributions, but good and fair member outcomes as well. And whether they want pounds of pension or a pot of money, and sort of things like certainty in retirement and flexibility in the type of benefits that they can have. So we'll have a look at how those things work in a CDC scheme. And if you've got any other things that you think members might want from their pension scheme, do please pop them in the chat and we can discuss how they work through. So very broadly, a CDC scheme, you've got contributions in, they can be employer and or member contributions going into a pooled fund that will then pay out the benefits, as generally most schemes do. If we're looking at focusing on the contribution sides of that, the employer and member contributions are generally fixed. So they will be stable contributions for both the employer and the member, achieving that. So in the CDC's designs that we're looking at, there wouldn't be additional contributions if there wasn't enough money to pay the target benefits. The amount of contributions are the contributions that go into the fund. So that achieves those two objectives. What the member sees for the contributions that they pay into their scheme will be a benefit statement, giving a target pension that they would be likely to get in retirement, targeting it in retirement. So that gives them a pound of pension per annum rather than a pot of money, although it would be possible to take a transfer value out from the scheme. But the main benefit is couched as a pound amount per annum that the member would get at retirement, and it would be paid for life. So it ticks the requirement for the member to get their pension for life. Now the increases, Stephen and Adrian are going to talk about a little bit later, but they are targeted increases, both before and after retirement. One increase for both, and to use the term increases, there can be a certain amount of decrease in the pension if there is not enough money to pay the flat level of benefits. But the increases themselves are the answer to the sort of question, what makes the amount of assets in the scheme equal to the target liabilities on a best estimate basis. I know Stephen and Adrian are going to be talking about that mechanism a little bit more, so I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but just to give you a broad idea, the idea is that every year the assets line up with the target liabilities by moving the target pension increase up or down to the relevant amount. So once we've got some contributions into the scheme, the pooled fund is invested in quite a return-seeking way, a long-term way, basically, because we're looking at long-term benefits, and the benefits aren't guaranteed, so there's no requirement to match the liabilities in quite the same way as for example, a DB scheme might do. So the members would have no investment choice. I've put that as a choice, but it's the investment is decided by the fund and how it's going to prove. So some members
I think we've got a frozen Chris. Yeah, Steve, do you want to sort of pick up the point there? You're on mute, Steve.
Yeah, so I don't have access to Chris's slides, so what I could do is, whilst we wait for Chris to return.
I'm back yet. Is that working?
Chris, I can hear you. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah. I'm so sorry. Yeah, can you see the slides?
Yeah,
we can see the slides.
Just carry on from where you left off, Chris.
Okay, cool. Sorry, so I was just saying that investment choice, I've put that as a as a question mark because some members like the investment choice and some members would like it chosen for them. So in a CDC scheme, the investment would be chosen by those running the scheme. The members would not get that option. Money is working hard for members because it's a long-term investment, and so there would be a considerable amount of investment in return-seeking assets, and so the expected return would be higher than sort of for a standard DB scheme. There would be volatility and fluctuations involved with that, but generally the money would be working hard for the members. And certainty in retirement, I've put a question mark by that. It's more certain than a DC scheme in terms of if you get a DC fund would fluctuate by more than the expected target pension would fluctuate in under a CDC scheme, but there's no doubt that a DB scheme, the target pension is more certain than a under a well-funded DB scheme with a good employer covenant. The member would have more certainty over their pension than a CDC scheme. So moving on to the benefits, when the benefits are paid out, there are different scheme designs, but there are good ways of making it good and fair member outcomes for the members when the benefits are paid. And the benefits, as mentioned earlier, are paid for life and give relatively good certainty in retirement. There's a certain amount of volatility, but considerably less volatility than you would get under a DC scheme. So the members have a good base to base their retirement planning on. So just the other aspects of CDC schemes that we haven't covered as yet, and I'm not going to go through these in detail because I know Stephen and Adrian look at some of these. There are the CDC scheme design would reduce the gender pensions gap given the higher level of benefits expected from them, and staff do value them. Now that staff value benefit, I wasn't sure they'd put it under the question mark or the ticks. I wasn't sure how well members understood it, but Adrian informs me his postman is delighted to be getting a CDC scheme coming through and does value the benefit very well. So there's that element there. Simple and understandable design, I was also not unsure where to put that because it's not the hardest design in the world. It is a fairly simple structure to most CDC schemes, but it is a new benefit, so a new type of scheme. So members do need to understand certain parts of that to gain full understanding and learn a little bit about the scheme. There are flexibility in the benefits that can be produced and more coming under the new consultations, but things like guarantees and death benefits wouldn't be allowed within a CDC scheme. Legislative certainty, everything's being done to make it as certain as possible. The legislation is clear on what's being done, but obviously it's a developing area and things are changing. So that should be borne in mind by those setting them up. Cheap to set up and run, it's just there's a lot of learning at the moment and a lot more things to be going through. So that could be expected to be a little more expensive than most other schemes to set up at this scale at this time. And there's a certain scale required to run a CDC scheme, and it does rely on the actuarial assumptions that are chosen. So those are the extra points to sort of consider. So I don't know if there were any questions in the chat about any other sort of benefit designs or important parts of benefit design that people wanted to see.
One of the questions, Chris, is regarding why does CDC reduce the gender pensions gap? That's from Phil. So
oh, cool. So we've currently got a system where a lot of the money goes through to sort of the historic DB schemes effectively, and the sort of existing or the new sort of DC schemes are generally not getting the same level of contributions, and that perpetuates the sort of there was a gender pay gap that was bigger than it currently is, and that's reducing, but the pensions gap takes longer to reduce effectively. And if more money is going into the sort of more historic pensions than the DB pensions, sort of filling up those gaps, then it takes longer for the gender pensions gap to reduce than the gender salary gap. So if under CDC the outcomes are better than under certain other types of pension scheme for the amount of money going in, then that will reduce the gender pensions gap more quickly.
Okay, cool. Brian Gannon, you've got a question as well regarding death benefits. Brian, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or?
Oh yeah. Hi, Chris. Very good presentation. Yeah, just wondered. I think I work for MAPS Money and Pension Service, and one of the things we sort of find people who have annuity style and DB style death benefits is the pension benefits is the lack of flexibility and the lack of option to leave death benefits to anyone other than dependent children or spouse partner. Could there be a way of using CDC to offer more flexibility in terms of who might get the death benefits compared to traditional DB, such that that might make it rather more popular to many people who resist DB for the reason I mentioned? Very long-winded, sorry.
No, that's a very good question. So, I mean, generally, the idea around the CDC is that the mortality risk is pooled, so that if members who kind of live for a long time benefit, but those who maybe die younger will not get as much benefit from the scheme. There is no reason that the sort of the dependents pension is payable in a similar way to DB, and I don't really see that there's a sort of massive difference in that. It may be possible to sort of expand the scope of that, but it's quite an important feature that the mortality risk is shared and the sort of the benefit is paid for life. So you wouldn't want to kind of necessarily refund members who died very quickly. You wouldn't want to refund all their benefits, because that would lose out. Other members would lose out at that stage effectively.
Could there be a way? Totally get that. So could there be a way, like, you know, with some public sector schemes, rather than getting better death benefits, you can pay higher contributions for quicker accrual? Could you perhaps design something where people could voluntarily, it's almost like life insurance really, voluntarily pay higher contributions in order to secure more flexible death benefits? So you've still got the pooling for in a way, because I really do think you need to understand that people are resistant to DB en masse because of the inflexibility. The number of people we get on our helpline saying, I object to DB because unless I've got a wife or young kids, the pension's lost. And it's just trying to think of a creative way of trying to reduce that objection, because I'm very much a friend of CDC, but I do see their point.
Should I feeling, and it looks like Julian's gone up. Julian will probably have a really good answer. Maybe he's got another question. I think one of the things we're seeing is this desire to include all the flexibilities that we've traditionally seen in DB and potentially more. And I think that recognition that we have the ability to design pensions that, you know, these original schemes, DB schemes, were designed 50, 60 years ago, and really haven't been thought about much since. We do have the opportunity to get these options in there. It is very important part of the scheme design phase, though, that these things are priced on best estimate assumptions, and there can be some interesting and perhaps counterintuitive effects of doing that. And I think Adrian's got some comments on some of those principles in his section. But yeah, in theory, we can get all these things in and more if it's what people and employers want. I say. Julian, did you?
Yeah, my answer was a bit simpler to that, but was exactly the same, which was it fundamentally comes down to what the actuaries can design and price. And obviously there's a sort of a balance between something simple that people can understand, but against something that's more complicated and has more choice involved in it. But, you know, as I said, fundamentally it comes down to not being precious about what these schemes look like, as long as you get that balance right, and as long as you make sure that pricing is fair and doesn't create unintended sort of intergenerational effects or all sorts of things like that.
Chris, do you have any more points, or shall I whiz on to my section?
Oh yeah, no, please go on.
I thought I might just be brave, given the questions that come in. I might actually start with my last slide rather than my first slide, so apologies if I go out of sync later on. Right. Am I sharing my screen now?
Yes.
Yep.
Cool.
Yep, it's good.
So Yeah, it's just say, and Chris covered some of this, but it's taking back to, I guess, what we're trying to achieve. Fundamentally, we are trying to achieve better member outcomes for a given spend effectively. So we've got some of these key principles we're trying to achieve. We'll show some. I have a very simple slide later on that just shows a little bit of the modelling that says, yeah, for a given pound of spend, we do think we can achieve a higher outcome than, for example, a typical DC scheme. But from the employer perspective, and Chris mentioned, why are employers so keen on CDC? Who are the employers who are really going to be keen on CDC? Well, it's those who really are quite attached to the idea of providing an income in retirement to their members, who are perhaps quite paternalistic, think heavily unionised industries, think former nationalised industries, but really don't like the idea of deficits and have perhaps struggled with those in the past. So let's create a situation where we can provide what appears to be an income in retirement that reduces the risk of deficits, also removes the risk of deficits. And with that having been achieved, actually are employers then willing to pay more into pensions than they otherwise would have done? Now, empirical evidence on this is difficult, but I believe that sponsors will be generally willing to pay more money into pensions if they believe that those benefits are appreciated and if those risks of deficits are removed. And then you can have a lot of flexibility with benefit designs, but fundamentally, if more money is going into pensions, I think that's a good thing for member outcomes. There's lots of debate on how we can achieve this. I'm now going to whiz up to my first slide, which hopefully you can all see a sort of timetable type slide here. Because I thought it would be interesting just to reflect on where we are. Julian may have some additional comments in terms of timetabling, but good to reflect on where we are and actually why we think this next step to multi-employer CDC is going to be so important. So as many of you will know, since last year, we've had everything we've needed for single employer schemes and also connected multi-employer schemes. And those were the regs used by the Royal Mail, who went through an approvals process with the pensions regulator earlier this year. But for almost everybody else, those regulations currently look really quite restrictive. And in particular, for many large groups that currently potentially happily provide group-wide defined benefit pensions, on closer inspection, they have one or more unconnected employer, which would make CDC impossible for them at present. And as I mentioned, that includes a lot of those groups, perhaps those heavily unionised, paternalistic organisations for whom CDC is attractive. As I'll go into in a few moments, considerations around benefit structure are also really quite important because the current regs are really quite restrictive around those as well. And in response to these challenges, over the past year or so, we've seen the range of formal and also informal discussions with DWP from various interested groups around developments they will need to make CDC work for them. So this all led to the consultation we saw earlier in the spring. The draft regulations we're now expecting in autumn. I was going to say something. I will leave it to Julian to give me the estimate of when we are expecting the autumn regulations. Hopefully in the autumn. All being well, that allows multi-employer schemes to emerge by late 2024 or early 2025. We know that DWP are consulting separately on principles for decumulation-only schemes, which will then be the third stage of implementation, and Adrian will cover that a little later. On timings, we know that getting decumulation-only schemes in place will need extra work, especially due to the commercial and consumer protection considerations. I'd expect those to follow a little later, perhaps 2026. But I personally don't think that's a bad thing, as it gives time for the critical mass to visibly build up in the more traditional workplace schemes and really create the demand out there. Now, I will try and whiz through the actuarial stuff very, very quickly. But I do think it's important for today's discussion that we address some key principles for why we think CDC is going to be a good thing. Firstly, what might a benefit structure look like? Well, on the left-hand side, I've set out the published Royal Mail design, which I do understand is available publicly online. Some key observations here Under the current regs, most schemes, I think, would actually need to look quite a lot like that design, notably with a single accrual rate. Other views are available, but for me, that design doesn't work very well for a multi-employer scheme. In particular, across a group or an industry, we'll likely find a range of employers wanting to pay a range of different contribution rates. We'll also find employee groups with different age characteristics. And for these populations, so a single accrual rate and a single contribution rate can lead to some quite significant cross subsidies. In particular, it's younger members who would likely end up taking the most risk, as their expected future investment returns would subsidise older members. Now, for this reason, we and many others in the industry in their consultation responses have suggested more flexible age-related structures. How might this work? Well, I've illustrated some very, very high level numbers here for, say, essentially a single life pension, where perhaps £1 of contributions might say by 14p of accrued pension at age 45, but that might fall to 10p at age 55. As an aside, it's also worth noting that as in the DB world, recent changes to market conditions have had quite a helpful influence on the cost of accrual. And so, for example, we suspect that at the end of the last year, the cost of a similar type structure to the Royal Mail might have actually fallen relatively significantly since it was first put forward. Now, moving on, what might member outcomes look like? Again, I've set out some high-level analysis here. Firstly, one of the key features of CDC is that, as Chris mentioned, every year we do our valuation, and based on that valuation, we work out what pension increases are affordable. And it's also true that in very extreme circumstances, pensions can go down. Now, how likely is that? Again, some observations here. Our back testing suggests it's really quite unlikely in a well-designed scheme. For example, the chart at the top shows 25 years of back testing, and we can see from the pink line that a scheme would have generally performed quite well during the period. You'll notice at the end, we then start moving into a high inflationary environment. And I think this is a really interesting development for CDC, as it potentially brings out a really fantastic feature that CDC in theory protects really well in a cost of living crisis. For example, as there are theoretically no caps, if inflation is, say, 10%, we award a 10% increase. Now, a key caveat to that is it does rely on investments performing. It does rely on our other assumptions not changing as a result. But what it does do is show that CDC generally performing well in a high inflationary environment. And if we move on to investment, and this is where we see CDC's real engine and where we get a huge amount of debate, it's just worth noting where that debate comes from. I've highlighted here the amount of growth assets we might see in an open DB scheme, a DC scheme, and a CDC scheme. And as an aside, it's hard to imagine a more growth-focused pension, particularly since it's mansion house developments. It's hard to imagine a more growth-focused pension than a CDC scheme. And the key argument here is that by running a pooled CDC arrangement for longer, we're able to invest in growth assets for far longer than in traditional arrangements, perhaps deep into retirement. I've circled that additional period here, and means that compared to, say, a lifestyle CDC scheme, that's where we can see these projections that show expected member outcomes of up to 50% higher. Now, I've whistled through that very quickly. We'll take some questions in a moment. And going back to this final slide, we do see these key reasons for wanting to put CDC in place for sponsors. We do find that there are a lot of large employers who do see CDC as very attractive and are waiting for the regulatory certainty to announce their hands to put things in place. It has been fantastic to have the Royal Mail effectively as a test case for that. It's just been fantastic in scheme design discussions, and it is to be hoped that as we move into the decumulation only phase, we can then see good positive experience from hopefully the range of multi-employer schemes that will emerge. Now, I will touch on some of the challenges, which I know Adrian will cover in a bit more detail. Scale is clearly one of them. You are going to need about 5,000 or more employees largely for self-financing reasons. If you have someone who's going to foot the bill for the cost of running the scheme, you can make it work with a small number of people, and perhaps 2,000 makes it work actuarially. But you probably need about 5,000 employees. Communications is obviously going to be a massive challenge. Members are just not used to this kind of arrangement yet, and will need to be taken on a journey. And there is actually quite a lot going on under the bonnet of a CD scheme. Members won't see a huge amount of that, but it needs to be taken into account nonetheless. The administration requirements are not to be taken lightly, and it's clearly going to be massively important to get that industry critical mass. So I've just covered a huge amount of ground there, but I will now come off slides. I'm afraid I wasn't able to see any questions that emerged whilst I was whizzing through, but I can take some now.
There's quite a lot of statements in the chat. Henry, do you want to go first?
Yep. Okay, my question is this. If there is so much enthusiasm from employers, why aren't employers sticking their hands up and saying, I want to do it? Why have we got absolutely no names on the list of a CDC pipeline? Why have we not got these employer groups you talk about actually talking this up? Yeah, where is the demand and why isn't it visible? Okay, so my personal view is that there have been a number of employers watching Royal Mail. A lot of those employers have been well aware they weren't actually able to do anything until the regulations are in place for them. It's also quite a big thing, and these are large groups that we're talking about. It's a very big thing for them to announce big changes, but it's a very natural thing for them to have been following these processes. What I hope is that when we see the multi-employer regulations that are then consulted upon, that process will see quite a lot of interested parties becoming far more public about what their plans are. That's certainly what I hope the outcome will be. There are certainly a lot, in my experience, who are talking about it.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. We've got a question from Akash, who doesn't want to get too actuarial, but obviously concerned really on interest rates, as in what are you using in terms of volatility? Because is now a good time for CDC? Or Akash, do you want to ask the question? You've got a big point there, I guess, Akash. So
yeah, I think it was half answered by I think Steve, you said that the interest rates have helped the contribution rate. It was yeah, take that question as wide as you want. I mean, clearly with volatile rates recently, yeah, what are the contribution rates and how might they vary?
I mean, yeah, again, what the contribution rates relies a lot on what the benefit structures are. But I mean, my illustration, if I just share this screen here, go back to this slide here. Now, I perhaps should have caveated, LCP have not been involved in any of the Royal Mail work. However, it is the published structure that's out there, and therefore it's the one that everyone who is also looking at it, you know, does various bits of back testing against it. My suspicion is that, you know, these contribution rates that I think were calculated 2-3 years ago in a different world might well have fallen down to this somewhere in this lower range now. And then these kind of structures here are very much consistent with those kind of rates here. So the implication is that for a contribution rate in that 15 to 20% range, you can produce something that is going to produce these kind of outcomes. Now, when we compare that to a DB world where we're used to sort of contributions 30% or more, it's obviously beneficial for employers. But when we compare to the DC world where we're used to, I think, typical contribution rates of, I think, average is about 10% across the country, it's clearly better. And harks back to my original point, which is you can completely hate the scheme design, but if I'm with employers paying twice the amount of money in, it's hard to argue too much. So I think that should win quite a lot of support for CDC.
and in reality, Stephen, it's well, yeah, double. But if you take 8% as a standardized auto enrollment rate, it's double that, isn't it? Effectively. So some employers will be on board, and some employers will go, ouch.
So what I hope we'll see is employers thinking, well, you know what, within our current spend, we can do this. That's obviously easier in some industries, finance industries where 20% contribution rate is far more typical for DC, for example. Others, I think, who perhaps step down quite a lot when they put their DC schemes in place, might think, well, actually, if this is a good quality scheme that will help me attract and retain the best staff, I am prepared to pay more because it just looks like a better benefit, and I'm not risking the deficits that used to come from DB.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, Stephen. Adrian, Stephen, do you want to pass to Adrian, or?
Yeah. So I think I'm done. I'll risk of taking up Adrian's time. Let's hand over to Adrian, and hopefully there's time for a few Q&A at the end to wrap up.
Yeah.
Right, thank you all. And hopefully you can see slides. Can you see slides okay? Because if so, I will crack on. So I'm going to talk about decumulation CDC now. This is like sort of half a CDC scheme, in that we only start from retirement onwards, but it's the best half. So if you think of my motoring analogy, think Triumph Spitfire. You've got a sort of lovely twin carb engine up front. You've got 2 leather sports seats. You've just ditched the seats at the back. You're not having to drive around carrying them with you all the time. So decumulation CDC will be a new option for savers at retirement in a DC pension plan. So it will sit as the options alongside annuity, drawdown, cash it in, or do nothing. The ones that MAPS take you through at the moment if you go on a guidance session. At retirement, it's for people who have been saving up in DC schemes, and they would swap that DC pot for a lifelong income commencing at the date that they enter the CDC scheme. The expectation is that that income will be increasing each year, keeping pace broadly with the cost of living over the longer term, but annual increases might be higher than expected, could be lower than expected, and extreme circumstances can go into reverse, and there could be a reduction in the pension payments. There are a few important choices that the member needs to make at retirement on joining a decumulation CDC scheme. They need to think about, do they want to have a dependent partner's pension if they are, attached to a partner that is depending upon them? It would be critical for some pension to continue if they died first. Do they want to have some form of lump sum payment if they died early so that the pension doesn't all die with them? And Chris mentioned there's no investment choice in a CDC scheme, but there could be a range of decumulation CDC schemes that you might be choosing between when you're choosing your decumulation CDC scheme. And you might find that some of those have different risk profiles. Some of them follow more adventurous investment strategies, which might mean that they could be a little bit more volatile in what they deliver. So if I move on to the next slide. And forgive me, this is a bit, I always find a wee bit tricky on the change. Has that changed the next slide, people?
Yep.
Yep. Thank you. Excellent. Good. Sorry about that. It's not that I'm not best at. So underwriting on entry is a key thing which happens here. Bit like an annuity, you'll be familiar when you swap your DC pot for an annuity, you go through an underwriting process. And there's a range of factors, sort of age, health, occupation, postcode, and so forth. Things which are designed to reflect the fact that some people, when they reach retirement age, have a longer life expectancy than others. And those that have a shorter life expectancy would be given a slightly larger pension at the time of entry. Those with a longer life expectancy, a lower level. The one on the bottom here is, I think, perhaps a contentious factor. Will you be able to underwrite on gender or not? And the regulations as they stand at the moment, because CDC is an occupational pension scheme, would allow the scheme to underwrite on gender. My personal hope is that schemes won't. I think there could be an issue if it isn't outlawed, in that if a different scheme was underwriting on gender and your scheme wasn't, would you be kind of like competing with one hand tied behind your back? So I'm hoping that as the regulations unfold, we'll get one from DWP that sort of forbids the underwriting on gender on a decumulation CDC scheme. But that's all to play for. Moving on to slide 3, I want to touch on the annual increase announcement. How does that work? The critical thing, Steve took you through a bit of this, is that you are setting the current value of liabilities equal to the current value of assets each time you do this. Done on a best estimate basis, and important to understand that there are no reserves. There is nothing held back. There isn't the sort of the old with profits concept of some sort of inherited estate. There's no scope for carpetbaggers. There's nothing here for them to come and try and join and to bag. And best estimate probably means that none of the usual actuaries need to apply for the job, because actuaries traditionally like to sort of sneak in a margin here and a margin there and act in a fairly conservative way. We don't want conservative valuations. We want best estimate valuations. Having done your valuation, the trustees get the balance by adjusting the annual rate of increase. And what happens when they adjust the annual rate of increase is that rate going forwards is then the rate that the scheme is expecting to apply to all future years. And what that means is that it's a relatively small change in the expected rate of future increase, because it's going to apply to all future years, makes up quite a big change in the value of liabilities. So that's why we think we will get quite a lot of stability in this, with although asset values, in the market will bob up and down quite a bit, because that's what assets do, the scheme liabilities can absorb that with relatively small changes. Same rate of increase given to all scheme members, the only exception being if you divided the scheme into a number of segments, in which case it's like a sort of section of mini schemes, then everybody in the same segment would still get the same increase. Now, because you're applying the rate of increase to all the future years, the change in the rate of increase then has a bigger effect on younger members than it does on the older members, because the older members, God bless them, haven't got many more increases to go. And what that means is that if the member looked at the actual value of their future instalments, they won't unless they're actuaries, but if they did, then they'd notice that the value of the future instalments is more volatile for younger members than for older members. But I kind of think that's all right. I think that's consistent with the sort of notional asset allocation within the scheme, where you'd say actually the more volatile, more growth-based assets were actually nominally allocated to the younger members, and safer assets nominally allocated to older members. I want to talk about who's the right customer for this, who's the wrong customer for this. If you are a sort of FCA type person, then you're very familiar with Consumer Duty, which has come in, which has said that FCA regulated firms need to have a view as to who the correct customer to be buying their products is, and need to be watching in case too many of the wrong customers are buying. So the customer that's right for a CDC decumulation is somebody that wants an income that won't run out before they die. They want a lifelong income. They broadly want to maintain their living standards as prices increase. They want to make their choices at the time that they retire and their income commences, and that from then onwards, so they want the trustees to manage everything on their behalf. These are also people that want to consume their entire pot as pension. They're not the sort of, inheritance tax escape vehicle that they've been viewing, leaving it all to the kids. They want to consume the whole lot as pension, and CDC will do that. It's a bit like my butcher shop. They've taken an entire pig into the shop, and they use everything but the oink in terms of making up different joints and sausages and so forth. I think it's also people that know how they would cope if their pension payments went down. And for me, one of the things that we would do, when we were prospecting for customers and when we were talking to people who were thinking about, do they want to move that DC pot across and have a CDC decumulation pension, I'd say to them, well, think, how would you manage if your pension payment was 10% smaller next year? If that's anathema to them and they haven't the foggiest how they could manage, then they're not the right customer for me. On the right-hand side of your screen, I've got a selection of people I think are the wrong customers. The first 4 I see as customers that really ought to be in drawdown. These are people that want to leave an inheritance. They want to choose that they want some money in sort of Japanese equities and stuff. They want to have the flexibility to say some months they want to have more income, other months less income. And perhaps if they get fed up with it, they just want to be able to transfer out and go to another provider. You can do all of that with drawdown. You can't do that with CDC. My next two bullets are for people that would be much better in an annuity. If they want to have a level income, then that's something that an annuity will provide to them. I might ask them the same question I had on the previous customer. I might say to them, how would you cope if next year prices were 10% higher than they are this year? And if they haven't thought that one through, then actually maybe the annuity wasn't right for them either. And lastly, I think CDC decumulation is not for people that have got a sort of very small pot. You wouldn't want to have a very small pot and employ an actuary to sort of manage it and give it its valuation and the rest of it. So if they've got a very small pot, consolidate that pot somewhere else, and then do something with it, or just cash it in, but probably not a CDC. And my very last slide to sort of finish with is to sort of chat about where is CDC going to fit in the decumulation market. I kind of sort of try and diagramize the market and say, well, if I plot all my customers by their wealth and their risk tolerance, the extremes you're familiar with, annuity for the people that have got a Ford Mondeo, income drawdown for the people that run a sort of BMW. But now some new bits are coming into the middle of that space because we're getting quite a lot of innovation coming through in the decumulation market. So a good market, I think, in the middle there for CDC, another market developing where people want to blend annuity and drawdown and do some of each, buy both bits at once at 65, put them together. There's another theory that says, no, you want to do flex first, fix later. And sort of itemize that you're going to buy your annuity when you reach age 78 and a half. And pooled annuity funds, that's a sort of bit like a CDC in that you are sharing mortality in a CDC-esque sort of way, but you're not sharing interest, investment risk. And they're not available yet. They'd be FCA regulated if they do become available. But the team at Heriot-Watt University has done some fantastic research working out, how they'd work, and maybe they'll come and join the fund too. And so at that point, I think I can stop sharing if I know how to do that. I found a button to do that. That's good. And I can hand back for questions on, either the decumulation or indeed on any of the matters that we've been talking about so far.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That's a really good presentation on the decumulation phase. One thing we've set up before everybody, we've got about 11 minutes to go. We've set up a poll, and Andre's got a poll, and we're going to ask you 2 questions on the poll, which could create some discussion points. So, Andre, do you want to put the poll up for everybody to vote on? And then I'd also like to come to Julian Barker, who's basically involved with CDC at the DWP. But let's see if we can do this poll first. So who thinks that CDC will work in the accumulation phase? So please click yes, no, or don't know, and then submit. Be very interesting to see if everybody thinks that CDC will work in the accumulation phase. So cast your votes, and then I think Andre will share those with us. So there we go. So okay, so over 50% of people think that CDC will work in the accumulation phase. Stephen Taylor, do you think that's positive news? And obviously I'll ask Julian to comment in a minute, but Stephen, you go first.
I think that's positive news. I know that another 28% just don't know. It's only a relatively small who are very fixed opposed. I think if you'd done that a year ago, you'd have had far fewer than 56%, and it shows that we've come quite a long way. So I think I'm very positive in that.
Okay, Andre, do you want to do the second poll, which is following on from Adrian's very good presentation? So who thinks that CDC only works for decumulation? So again, can you click yes, no, or don't know? Okay, over 50% again. Adrian, coming to you. Fairly pleased with that number, I think. Oh, hang on, it's moving. It's moving.
I found that a confusing question actually,
no.
Steve, because I voted yes for that because I thought it was a question that says, does decumulation only CDC work? But in fact, it's not what the question says. The question says, will CDC only work in decumulation? So I think I cast my vote in the wrong way, and I probably should have said no. It's one of these complicated survey questions, because I think CDC will work for both accumulation and decumulation. And I think it'll be a range of different customers, and that the accumulation section is going to work for people that have relatively stable employment. So take Royal Mail, my postie, who, as Brian said, is really, really excited about his coming CDC scheme. He was running up and down, my road in Cheam here 25 years ago when we moved in. And he's kept that beat ever since and delivered our letters, every day other than when he has a holiday or the occasional sickness. And that's one type of worker. There are other industries where people come and they go, and they dip into an industry and they work there for a few months and they go on somewhere else. Those sort of people are probably much better suited to a DC scheme for the accumulation phase, because you can very easily add together little different bits of DC pots. But they will, I think, hugely benefit from a decumulation CDC approach when they get to retirement and they're able to put together all the bits of sort of cash pot that they've built up in different employers. So I think there's different marketplaces. I think they'll both work.
Okay, Adrian, thank you for that. Julian, I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to ask Andre in the background to redo the question. There we go. Hey, as if by magic, a new
lovely,
question
excellent.
appears.
Now I really do want to vote yes for this.
Right. Does decumulation CDC work? Okay. Please cast your vote, ladies and gentlemen. And we will see what comes. There we are. There we are. So hopefully, Julian, that's what you wanted. So that brings you in very nicely, Julian, to maybe say a few words on behalf of where you're at the moment on this subject.
Yeah, thanks. You asked about what I wanted. I think the important thing here is kind of what members and employers want, and that's the sort of fundamental question here. And I've been, in the 10 years I've been working in pensions policy, I've been very conscious that what members and employers want is different things to what they have. The system has been very static and stable for a long time, and not necessarily in a good way in terms of the products available to actually deliver a pension in retirement. And that's what's always excited me about CDC as being a really, I think an intelligent way of looking at the problem and looking at ways of trying to get better outcomes. And I know, people have quite rightly asked the questions about, well, how do we know people want this and where is the real demand, etc. Believe me, if I hadn't had people wanting to talk to me about this ever since, sort of beginning of 2018, and the sort of evidence of that demand, I wouldn't still be here doing this job. The government would have given up a long time ago, I'm sure. I mean, this has taken us 5 years to get to where we are, and it's because it's new, it's difficult, it's complicated, it has to be done right, and it is taking a long time. But there is real commitment, and has been growing commitment within government as well as outside, sort of thing Stephen was talking about more and more interest in this. And that's really what this is about. And what I would like to say is, I don't believe CDC in itself is necessarily the only answer. I think it is an approach that can be used in various ways, as we discussed, to deal with the needs of various groups. But I'm also conscious that there's probably other ways of doing things as well. And I'm always open to people coming with fresh ideas. I just think that the most of the problems we have in the current system around decumulation do need some good ideas about resolving them at the moment. CDC is probably the best front runner.
Thanks to Julian. That's very positive. We'll come to Stephen again, just with a response to that, Stephen. And if you'd like to ask a question in the last sort of 5 minutes, please just raise a hand. There's a lot of chat going on. Brian, you've made some comments in the chat, so we'll maybe come to you after Stephen. But if you want to ask a question, please raise a hand.
Well, just we're waiting for a question. I mean, oh, go on. Then there is one question. Brian, do you want to?
Oh yeah, hi. Sorry, I feel like I'm monopolising this a little bit, but one of the things that we've sort of seen quite recently is the cost of living crisis. And at MAPS, we've done a lot of presentations. We've spoken to probably over 15,000 public sector workers, where we've done webinars explaining how the career average scheme works at the moment. And to give you some feedback, I think once people understand how something works, they're a lot more signed up for it. But equally, I think the other thing we found is lots and lots of nurses, doctors, administrators are finding it very difficult to afford the cost of living now. And could CDC be something? I mean, Henry mentioned, why are no employers coming to the party? Why are no sort of private employers coming to the party and supporting CDC? Is CDC actually a way of allowing the public sector departments to pay higher wages to people without just going straight to DC? Is it a way where, if you could get unions on side in the way that the Communication Workers Union came on side, the taxpayer could get better value for money and the employee could get a more suitable benefit package? More now, possibly a little bit less later than DB, but still with some sort of guarantee. I
mean, my personal view on that is that CDC would be a very good idea long term in the public sector. However,
yeah,
I'm aware that would face some quite considerable challenge. What I would say is unions in general are far more supportive of CDC than they were a couple of years ago. So they've gone very much from the ultra defensive around it to, okay, we need to understand how this works, and actually we can get behind it. So I think the unions are getting more on side. And as a vehicle for meeting a cost of living event, I think CDC, I think that's an unexpected gain, because when we were first thinking about CDC, inflation was basically non-existent. And now actually, your CDC scheme will provide you a proper inflationary increase, subject to all the other assumptions then following through. And that leads us to where we are. And probably my sort of closing statement will be, CDC is coming. We already have an approved scheme. Hopefully it'll launch fairly soon. Others will declare their hands. We've got lots of regulation train. We've got a very supportive government. We've got opposition parties who appear to be equally supportive. CDC is coming, and I guess the next couple of years will tell us, is it going to be a big thing, or is it going to be a sort of a smaller scale event? That remains to be seen. But I think over the next sort of 12, 18 months, we are going to see we're going to see a lot of those answers. I hope that when we see, in particular, this next set of regulations, that will be the spur for a far bigger debate in the industry, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Stephen. Chris, have you got a closing remark before we sort of wrap up? I mean, it feels like we need to keep going, I think, but I'm conscious everybody's got very busy days. But Chris, do you want to say a closing remark, and then we'll come on to Adrian?
Well, I was just going to say thanks for all the wonderful questions, and apologies we haven't got to them all yet, because there's a whole load of great points in there. I think one point I just wanted to address was Aaron's, that for a CDC you could recreate it by effectively having a DB and a DC sort of section. I think the one thing we haven't maybe covered too much is the cost of that DB guarantee. The cost of providing a DB benefit and an equivalent target CDC benefit they're about 40-50% different. So you can get a much kind of higher CDC benefit because of the fact there are no guarantees effectively, and that's the sort of major difference for me. But I'd echo what Stephen and Adrian said, that the sort of the support is coming on quietly, and I can understand the frustration that the employers aren't public yet, but that is coming, and I'm looking forward to the sort of challenges going forward. And thanks everyone for their engagement.
Fantastic. Adrian, your closing remarks?
Yeah, just very quickly, I'm hugely excited about decumulation CDC. I like it because it really meets the pensioners' needs. And in fact, one of those has just popped into the chat. Why is it that CDC pays out these increasing pensions each year? And there's two reasons for that. One is it's part of the inbuilt design of the thing. It is using the increases as the sort of shock absorber to deal with changes in asset values each year. So it's an important and integral part of the design. The other is it actually meets pensioner needs. And you know, I've had sort of quite a Damascene conversion here. I used to believe that pensioner monetary requirements went down in real terms as they became older. You know, the old Hackney phrase, well, they sort of, you know, go out less, so they spend less, so they don't need so much money. The research that the Institute for Fiscal Studies published last year actually debunks that and shows that what is actually happening with pensioner expenditure is that it goes up every year. Every year they spend more and more, and they are increasing their expenditure at CPI +1 until about age 80, and then a slightly lower rate, CPI -1, beyond age 80. So the idea of a CDC pension, which is targeting inflationary increases, is actually going to meet those real consumer needs, what people actually do, not what I used to think that they did.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Well, on that note, I would like to thank Stephen, Chris, and Adrian for their fantastic presentation. There's a number of virtual claps going on, and thanks in the chat. There are some interesting questions, Chris, as you say in the chat. So, you know, that's you know, very important that maybe there's 2 or 3 big ones in there you might want to respond offline on, I guess. So if anybody wants to see the answers to those questions, I'm sure I can get hold of a few of those answers, which would be great. And you know, really appreciate everybody's input today. Thanks for joining. Next week we have an update on the pensions regulator from Robin Ellison, so that should be quite an explosive discussion. Without any further ado, I was going to say thanks again for your time. The video of today's session will be on the pension playpen this afternoon, and as we usually say, if we need to pray for peace in the East. You know, we cannot believe it's now nearly the end of August and we're praying for peace in the East again. But thanks everyone for your time. Thanks for joining, everybody. And thanks, Aaron, for joining from America. Nice to see you. I'm waving virtually at you.
Sorry, I got the times all messed up again. I apologize.
That's fine, Aaron. No problem at all. But there's some good questions in there, and I'm sure people will come back to you. And your email address, Aaron, is in that in that chat. So Aaron has got a few doubts about CDC. So if there are any doubters, then please email Aaron in the chat. So, but without any further ado, thanks a lot, and really appreciate your time and your input. And thanks, Steve, Chris, and Adrian again. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much indeed. Take care, everybody. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks all.